The more you explain yourself to someone who has already decided to misunderstand you, the smaller you become. Not because your truth is weak, not because you lack the right words, but because every explanation slowly turns into a defense. You explain your tone, then your intention, then your boundary, then your silence, then your entire character. And before you realize it, you are no longer clearing up a misunderstanding. You are trying to prove you are not the person they have decided you are. That is what drains you. Not the conversation, the trial underneath it. You feel placed on a stand. Every word becomes evidence. Every pause becomes suspicious. Every emotion needs a reason. Every boundary needs a full report. So you keep talking. You tell yourself it is maturity. You tell yourself it is communication. You tell yourself if I can explain it clearly enough, they will understand. If I stay calm enough, they will stop assuming the worst. If I give enough context, they will finally see I meant no harm. So you add one more sentence, then one more paragraph, then one more apology you are not even sure you owe. And somewhere in the middle of proving yourself, something inside you starts to shrink. Because you are not being understood. You are being kept in defense. Over-explaining does not always come from having too much to say. Sometimes it comes from fear. The fear of being seen the wrong way. Selfish when you were only tired. Cold when you were only quiet. Difficult when you were only honest. Cruel when you were only setting a boundary. For some people, being misunderstood is not just uncomfortable. It feels unsafe. It feels like connection is about to disappear. Like love is about to be taken back. Like your place in someone's life depends on how quickly you can correct their version of you. That fear usually has a history. Maybe you grew up around people who assumed your motives before asking about them. Maybe you had to explain your face, your tone, your mood, your silence. Maybe peace depended on making yourself easy for other people to interpret. So now, even as an adult, a small misunderstanding can feel like a threat. A cold message can feel like rejection. A disappointed look can make your body rush into repair. A false accusation can make you want to open your whole chest and say, "Please understand me correctly." But the fear of being misunderstood is rarely about the misunderstanding itself. It is about what you believe it will cost you. Will they leave? Will they stop trusting me? Will I become the villain in a story I never agreed to be part of? Will I lose my place? So you explain. Not once. Not calmly. Anxiously. You explain until your own truth starts to sound uncertain. You explain until their perception feels more real than your reality. You explain until you forget that you were allowed to simply know what you meant. That is where the danger begins. Because the more you try to control how someone sees you, the more power you give them over your peace. There is nothing wrong with clarity. There is nothing wrong with saying, "This is what I meant." There is nothing wrong with repairing something when you truly caused harm. Healthy people clarify. Mature people take responsibility. But clarity and over-explaining are not the same thing. Clarity says, "Here is what happened." Over-explaining says, "Please do not think badly of me." Clarity has dignity. Over-explaining has fear inside it. Clarity ends when the truth has been spoken. Over-explaining keeps going because your nervous system is still begging to feel safe. That is why it feels so exhausting. You are not just communicating. You are trying to be permitted. Permitted to have a boundary. Permitted to be tired. Permitted to say no. Permitted to be misunderstood without being punished for it. And here is the part people avoid saying out loud. Not every request for an explanation is innocent. Some people do not ask because they want clarity. They ask because they want access to your reaction. They want to see you defend. They want to see you soften. They want to see how quickly you will abandon your position just to make the tension stop. The longer you explain, the longer they remain the judge. And the longer they remain the judge, the easier it becomes to doubt yourself. You may know exactly what you meant. But after defending it long enough, you start asking questions you never needed to ask. Maybe I said it wrong. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I am selfish. Maybe my boundary was unfair. Maybe I should have stayed quiet. That is how control often works. It does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like endless questioning, endless misinterpretation, endless demands for proof. And if you are someone who deeply wants to be kind, fair, and understood, you are easy to pull into that cycle. Because they do not have to defeat you. They only have to keep you explaining. The more you defend yourself, the more they learn where the buttons are. They learn which accusation makes you panic, which silence makes you chase, which disappointment makes you apologize before you even understand what happened. And eventually, explanation stops being communication. It becomes emotional labor for someone who has already decided what they want to believe. That is when saying more does not make you clearer. It makes you emptier. You give more context, more vulnerability, more apology, more access to your inner life. But if someone is committed to misunderstanding you, more access will not create more respect. It only gives them more material to distort. This is why the quiet power of not explaining yourself matters. It is not about becoming cold. It is not about refusing accountability. It is not about pretending you are above communication. It is about discernment. It is knowing the difference between someone who needs clarity and someone who needs control. A safe person may misunderstand you, but they will not enjoy watching you bleed emotionally to prove you meant well. A safe person may ask questions, but they will listen to the answer. A safe person may need time, but they will not turn every answer into a new accusation. The right people do not need endless evidence of your heart. They may need a conversation. They may need honesty. They may need repair, but they do not need you to perform innocence. And this is where many people have to grow, not by learning how to explain better, but by learning who deserves the full explanation. Some people deserve your patience. Some people deserve the long version. Some people deserve the vulnerable work of being understood. But not everyone deserves unlimited access to your inner courtroom. Not everyone deserves a seat inside your emotional life. Not everyone deserves to cross-examine your soul. Sometimes the most self-respecting thing you can say is simple. This is what I meant. This is where I stand. This is what I can offer. And then you stop. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because saying more would require you to abandon yourself. Over-explaining becomes dangerous when you start editing the truth just to make it easier for someone else to accept. You begin with clarity. Then you move into defense. Then you start shrinking. You soften the boundary. You apologize for the feeling. You explain pain you should have been allowed to have. You turn your truth into a carefully written essay. You make yourself smaller and call it keeping the peace. But sometimes what you call keeping the peace is really keeping yourself available for distortion. So ask the harder question. Am I explaining because this person wants to understand? Or because I cannot tolerate being disliked? Am I clarifying the truth? Or begging for permission to have one? That question can hurt, because it shows you the wound behind the habit. The belief that your truth is not valid until someone else agrees with it. The belief that being misunderstood makes you less real. The belief that if someone sees you incorrectly, their version of you becomes stronger than your own. But it does not. A person can misread you and still be wrong. A person can accuse you and still be projecting. A person can be disappointed and still not be entitled to control you. A person can tell a story about you and still not hold the truth of you. You are not required to chase every false version of yourself and correct it. That is not peace. That is captivity. Peace begins when you stop treating every false version of you as an emergency. This does not mean you hide from responsibility. Do not use silence as a weapon. Do not hurt people and call your refusal to explain strength. That is not strength. That is avoidance. Real strength can speak clearly. It can admit harm. It can repair. It can say, I was wrong. But once you have spoken honestly, Once you have taken responsibility where it belongs, once you have offered clarity without cruelty, you do not have to keep reopening yourself for someone who refuses to receive it. You do not have to defend the same truth in 10 different ways. You do not have to prove your heart is not as ugly as their suspicion. You do not have to turn your soul into evidence. This is where quiet strength begins. It begins when you can say less without feeling guilty. It begins when you can let a conversation end without forcing closure. It begins when you can be misunderstood without immediately betraying yourself to fix it. For people who survived by explaining, silence can feel terrifying. It can feel like losing control. It can feel like letting the other person win. Because part of you still believes that if you do not correct the story becomes true. But someone's perception of you is not your identity. Their confusion is not always your responsibility. Their disappointment is not always proof that you failed. Their inability to understand you is not always evidence that you were unclear. Sometimes people misunderstand because they lack the capacity. Sometimes they misunderstand because your boundary interrupts the version of you they preferred. Sometimes they misunderstand because seeing you clearly would require them to take responsibility. And sometimes they misunderstand because misunderstanding you benefits them. If seeing your pain clearly would require them to change, they may call you dramatic. If respecting your boundary would limit their access to you, they may call you selfish. If accepting your truth would challenge their control, they may keep asking for explanations until you are too tired to trust yourself. That is why saying less can be protection, not punishment. Protection. You are protecting the part of you that has spent too long trying to be acceptable to people who were never satisfied. You are protecting your energy, your dignity, your clarity, your right to exist without turning every choice into a defense. There is a quiet freedom in realizing you can be honest and still not be understood. You can be kind and still be called selfish. You can be clear and still be distorted. You can be gentle and still be rejected by someone who benefits from making you the problem. And when that happens, your job is not always to explain harder. Sometimes your job is to remain rooted, to stand inside what you know is true, to stop handing your piece to the least generous interpretation in the room. This is what "let them misunderstand you" really means. It does not mean you do not care. It does not mean communication does not matter. It means you have stopped confusing their perception with your identity. You have stopped believing every person must understand you before you are allowed to rest. You have stopped living as if your peace depends on being interpreted correctly by people who do not handle your truth with care. There is maturity in explaining yourself once. There is self-respect in not explaining forever. There is kindness in giving clarity. There is wisdom in recognizing when clarity is being wasted. And there is power in silence after honesty. Not the silence of resentment, not the silence of punishment, but the silence that says, "I have spoken truthfully, and I will not keep performing my innocence for someone committed to doubting it." That silence is not empty. It is full of self-respect. It is the moment you stop auditioning for understanding. It is the moment you stop negotiating with distortion. It is the moment you realize some people do not need more explanation. They need less access. This is especially hard when you are used to being the one who repairs everything, the one who explains first, apologizes first, softens first, smooths things over first. You may feel responsible for every emotional shift in the room. If someone is upset, you explain. If someone is distant, you explain. If someone is uncomfortable, you explain. If someone misunderstands you, you rush to fix it before they can leave. But you cannot build a peaceful life if you keep making yourself responsible for every interpretation of you. You cannot control what people do with your words. You cannot control the story they tell themselves. You cannot control whether they listen with generosity or suspicion. You can only control whether you abandon yourself trying to make them fair. That is the turning point. At some point, peace requires a different kind of courage. Not the courage to speak louder. Not the courage to explain better. Not the courage to convince harder. The courage to stop. The courage to let the silence sit. The courage to allow someone to have the wrong idea without handing them your nervous system. The courage to let a person reveal what they are willing to believe about you. Because that matters. When someone keeps choosing the worst interpretation, they are telling you something. When someone needs endless proof of your basic decency, they are telling you something. When someone turns every clarification into another courtroom, they are telling you something. Maybe the lesson is not that you need to explain better. Maybe the lesson is that you need to stop giving unlimited access to people who only know how to cross-examine you. The right people will not need you to bleed to believe your heart. They will listen for meaning, not just mistakes. They will care about repair, not control. They will ask questions that make room for truth, not questions designed to trap you. And with those people, explain. Speak. Clarify. Repair. Be open. Those relationships deserve language. They deserve patience. They deserve the vulnerable work of being understood. But when someone has shown you again and again that they are not listening to understand, you are allowed to stop supplying explanations for them to reject. You are allowed to save your breath. You are allowed to keep some parts of yourself private. You are allowed to let the conversation end before it costs you your center. You do not have to become hard. You do not have to become unreachable. You only have to become less available to being misread on purpose. Less available to bad faith. Less available to emotional traps. Less available to people who confuse your patience with permission. Less available to the belief that your worth depends on being correctly understood by everyone. Because it does not. Your worth does not shrink because someone misunderstands it. Your truth does not disappear because someone distorts it. Your heart does not become guilty because someone refuses to see it clearly. And your peace does not have to wait until every person agrees with your version of events. Sometimes peace comes when you stop trying to win the trial. Sometimes peace comes when you step out of the courtroom entirely. You let people think what they are committed to thinking. You let them hold the version of you they are determined to keep. You let their misunderstanding exist without making it your emergency. And you return to yourself. You return to what you know, what you meant, what you value, what you will own, what you will not carry. You return to the simple truth that being misunderstood is painful, but abandoning yourself to prevent it is worse. So explain when there is love. Explain when there is openness. Explain when there is mutual respect. Explain when the person in front of you is trying to meet you in truth. But do not keep explaining to people who only feel powerful when you are defending yourself. Do not keep translating your soul for people who benefit from misreading it. Do not keep shrinking your truth into something easier for them to control. The quiet power of not explaining yourself is not silence. It is discernment. It is knowing the difference between communication and self-betrayal. It is understanding that your peace was never meant to be sacrificed to someone else's suspicion. You can be clear. You can be kind. You can be accountable. And you can still stop. Sometimes that is the strongest thing you will ever do. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you finally know your dignity is worth more than being understood by someone committed to not hearing you. Real peace does not begin when everyone understands you. It begins when you stop putting your soul on trial for people who enjoy being the judge. It begins when you stop chasing every false version of yourself. It begins when you let the wrong story exist without moving out of your own truth. And one day you may realize the most powerful sentence is not an explanation at all. It is a decision. I will not defend myself to someone who is committed to not hearing me.